So, hello everyone. My name is Deborah Roberts, and I am the chair of the Stoughton Diversity and Inclusion Organization. The Stoughton Diversity and Inclusion Organization, in partnership with the Stoughton Public the Stoughton Public Library, welcomes you to this event. Now, I would like to introduce you to the board members of the Stoughton Diversity and Inclusion Organization. We have Steve Tapper, Teresa Tapper, Erdem Urel, Larry Horn. What did he say? Frank Mendoza, John Gunning. He's not on the board. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to Karma.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out this evening, and I hope I'm projecting enough that you can hear us. Back in November, I had a wonderful opportunity to sit in on an event in which Mr. Willie Wilson was giving a presentation on Frederick Douglass. And it was an amazing event in that he made history come alive. And so we had an opportunity to bring that presentation here. So right now, I'd like to introduce Mr. Willie Wilson. Mr. Wilson is and was a teacher of history at Brockton High School, and he is also a part of the Brockton Historical Society. So he has a lot of background information for Brockton, and hopefully one day we'll see that in a book. But I think you're going to really enjoy this presentation this evening. If you look around the room, you're going to see some paintings, and those paintings are done by Dr. Purnell Hilton. And he is not with us this evening. He's feeling under the weather, but the paintings are so lifelike and wonderful. So please, I hope you'll have that opportunity to check them out. I am not going to talk anymore, Mr. Wilson. I'm going to have you come forth and do what you do best. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's nice being here, and I see, even though I spent most of my career teaching at Brockton High, and I was also teaching in Worcester and other places. I did long-term substitute teaching here in the town of Stoughton. And I see one of my colleagues, Mrs. Manchester, and she kindly invited some of her students here for extra credit. So I think that's that extra bump we have in attendance this evening. But it's very, very, very nice to be here in this new space. Unfortunately, there's still some bugs, and so the sound system isn't working. What happens is, but I can project loud enough, being a teacher, but we are recording it for TV. But again, it's very nice to be here. I remember when the original library was next door where the Historical Society is now. In 1969, when I was in high school, this building opened up, the old building, and now rededicated with a new Stoughton library. It's just always good to be here in the town of Stoughton. I have a lot of affection for Stoughton. That said, yes.
Sir, if we wanted to ask a question, do we ask during the presentation or do we wait till the end?
I'd rather wait because otherwise I think we'd go on and on and on. So I'd rather wait. And I'm glad you brought that up, Erdem. Please make a notation because many times my students at the high school level, the college level, they'll have an idea and they'll forget the question. So you want to just, those students of Mrs. Manchester, you have your form, just write a question down and save that for the end. Any other questions before we get started? Very good. All right. Again, remember, this is not projecting, so the mic is just for the camera. Now, many people, Erdem, is that recording?
I see a little bit, but let me come and fix it for you.
Many people ask, well, how did I get involved with Frederick Douglass? What's my affinity to Frederick Douglass? And what I have to say is I was in 5th grade. I went to the library, the Brockton Public Library, and what happened was I read a book about Frederick Douglass, and so he has been, as I went to junior high, elementary school, junior high, high school, college. I've always read about him, and he's such, in my opinion, he is the quintessential American hero. So that's how I got involved in terms of doing research and visiting his home in Anacostia and New Bedford, and we'll talk about where he wrote his first narrative, the first issue in Lynn, Mass. We'll talk about that. But what I want to do, the committee had asked me to talk about Frederick Douglass and his push for women's suffrage, and so that's going to be the theme tonight. But intermixed with that will be his visits to Brockton, which was then North Bridgewater. So the first thing I want to talk about, there are three autobiographies on Frederick Douglass. The first is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, the first publication, which was written when he lived in Lynn, Massachusetts. And then we have two other versions of his autobiography, and I want to talk about his time here in Massachusetts. So this first slide is called The Big Shop, where Douglass gave his first big speech in Massachusetts. He escaped from slavery in Maryland, and he went to New York. And from New York, he went to New Bedford, and where he lived for a short time. And then he went to Lynn. He moved to Lynn. And while in New Bedford, he was asked to speak at a anti-slavery rally in Nantucket. And this is the site. It's called The Big Shop, where he gave his speech in August 16th of 1841. And William Lloyd Garrison and others were there, and they were just amazed. In fact, so many people, he was so eloquent, many people couldn't believe that he was a former slave. And that site is still there today, the site where the building was. This is in Nantucket. This is the African Baptist Church. When Frederick Douglass gave his speech, he stayed in a section of Nantucket called Guinea, and this is the African Baptist Church. And today, this is the site of the African American Museum in Nantucket, and at the time it was called New Guinea. Well, there we go. There's a current exhibit in Boston at the Museum of African American History on Joy Street. And those of you who haven't seen it, it was initially supposed to be in Boston for 1 year. And Mrs. Tapper was good enough. There's one book by Professor Sofer from Harvard that talks about the exhibit. But if you haven't had a chance, it's been extended. It's on its third year. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in the 19th century. This is a fact that the exhibit accounts for that and speaks to it, and there's a book over on the table that actually does detail. But he was so fascinated with photography when it first was created, and that's one of the reasons. So he said, and I quote, that the camera always tells the truth. So that's one of the reasons why he was photographed so many times. This is a picture of him in his 20s, but that exhibit on Joy Street in Boston on Beacon Hill is a must if you haven't seen it. This is sheet music to the Fugitive song. Now, you have to remember the abolitionists were in two groups. There were what we call radical abolitionists and then abolitionists. Now, the general abolitionists believed that African Americans should not be slaves. The radicals believe not only should they not be slaves, but they should have the same rights and privileges as white citizens. And so when they had these various meetings, they would also sing songs and rally. They would have tent meetings and so forth. And this is just the cover of some anti-slavery sheet music. In the city of Brockton, we had a street that was called High Street. It's off of Main Street. And it was renamed Frederick Douglass Avenue. This is a picture looking east from High and Warren Avenue. The area to the left is where currently Harbor One is located. And that's the site of what we call the Liberty Tree. The Liberty Tree was owned by, was part of property by Edward Eels Bennett, who was a radical abolitionist in North Bridgewater, which was the name of Brockton before it became a city. Now you have you see a garage there. He had a stable business. He used transport. He also dabbled with paint. But in the tree, right there to the left is what we call the Sycamore Tree or the Liberty Tree. It was planted, arborists believe, in 1763. And so as part of the Historical Society, it began to, there were problems. At the time, Security Federal on Legion Parkway was concerned that the limbs would fall, and there were concerns about their patrons and so forth. The Historical Society, we tried to save the tree, and finally it was decided that it had to come down. And I'm here to say today, now, even where we cut it, there's now a stump that's growing. And but this has now been rededicated. It's now called Frederick Douglass Avenue. This particular picture was taken about 1869. In 1959, Brockton High was established in 1864, first graduating class, 1867. And the class of 1959 at Brockton High decided to actually save the tree, and that class paid to have this particular plaque placed on the tree. Sorry to say that plaque is gone. They had several plaques that were stolen. And I think we're on our 8th iteration, which is now cemented into a huge boulder. And I want to just read to you what it says. Under this old sycamore tree were held many meetings to help free the slaves. Also, it was the station of the Underground Railroad. People of historical fame who once visited here were William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Parker Pillsbury, Amelia Bloomer, Dr. Mary Walker, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Henry B. Blackwell, Fred Douglass, and Topsy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, this tablet is the gift of the class of 1959 Brockton High School. This is a picture of the tree and the residence of Edward Eels Bennett in the background. So we have a situation where Frederick Douglass, and really you can't, you can read books about him, but the best way to really understand him is to actually read his speeches and the narrative. And so I will quote some of his famous speeches, some of and portions from the narrative as we go. His first wife, Anna Murray, was a free person of color who lived in Baltimore. After he escaped, she followed shortly after. They were married in New York City, and then, as I mentioned earlier, they proceeded to New Bedford. She never, during her entire life, she was illiterate. So, you know, on one hand, he was self-taught, never attended university, high school, everything was, he was self-taught. And we'll talk a little bit about how he put together pieces to further his education. Another picture of him. Frederick Douglass had 5 children, and so he had 3 sons and 2 daughters, and a lot of times my students would say, "Well, you know, you're very similar to Frederick Douglass," you know, because I had 3 sons and 2 daughters. He lived on Pearl Street in Lynn. I live on Pearl Street in Brockton. We were both born in February, and so. You know, my kids had pointed that out. This is his first daughter, the oldest child, Rosetta. Okay, and this is Lewis Henry Douglass. And some of you will remember he and his brother actually fought in the 54th, which was mustered out of Camp Meade in Hyde Park. During the Civil War. This is a picture of Frederick Jr. And the third son is Charles Raymond Douglas. Now, Frederick Douglass was a slave. He lived in Maryland, and what happened was he goes back to memories. He knew his mother lived on another plantation far away, so he was raised by his grandmother. His full name was Frederick Augustus Bailey. And I just want to read you a little section. He talks about his growing up, being a slave, being hungry, and what happens is his master sells him off to a relative, so he leaves the portion of Maryland where he grew up and he moves to Baltimore, and this is where he has an experience on the docks. He's actually a slave and servant to his owner's son, and he begins to interact, and he notices that the white children are reading, and what happens is his mistress teaches him, Mrs. Auld, teaches him how to read. And what happens is her husband comes home and realizes what has been happening allegedly behind his back, and he says, you can't do this. If you teach him how to read, if you teach a nigger how to read, you'll spoil him. He won't be good for servanthood. He will no longer be a slave. So she was forced, and Frederick writes about this in detail, and you can see a change in her. And he talks about how slavery impacts not only the slave, but the owner as well. And he sees a change in her behavior. And many people say, well, why didn't he run away? What you have to understand is he did run away. The first attempt failed, and he was brought back. And when he was brought back, he was sent to what we call a slave breaker. So his owner said, we're going to teach you a lesson, and he sent him to the slave breaker, who had a reputation for breaking the most obstinate and mean-spirited slaves. And what happened is, at one point, Frederick said he was very depressed. He writes about this in the autobiography, and he says, I'm not going to put up with it anymore. And he actually fights this slave breaker, and they're fighting in the barn. And what happens is, after that fight, the slave breaker, instead of, he left him alone. And he didn't want his reputation to be released that he couldn't break a slave. And so there was like an uneasy peace between Fred and him, and he was sent back to his master. This is where he's working in the ports of Baltimore, the port of Baltimore, and he gets the idea in terms of, also he's at this time he's seeing and dating Anna Murray, who's a free woman of color, and he finally decides that he's going to run away. So the second attempt is more successful, and he does run away, and then she follows. I'm condensing because I'm putting a lot of materials together. I want to say that we had Frederick Douglass Jr. Married and had children, and his descendants, some of them are still alive today. We've had Frederick Douglass IV has been to Brockton at least on 3 occasions, hosted by Messiah Baptist Church on 2 of those occasions. And so there are current descendants of his family that are still living today. Now, what happened was his wife, Anna, was ill, and I'm speeding up. Well, but let's just take a short break. Let's go to the Lynn years. There's one book that's not on the table, and this is a wonderful collection over here on the table that Mrs. Tapper put together. But there's one book called Frederick Douglass, The Lynn Years, 1841 to 1848. And this was written by Tom Dalton, who he was a journalist for the Boston Globe, and he's retired, and this was one of his retirement projects, to research about Frederick Douglass while he lived in Lynn. Once Frederick Douglass, he actually escaped from slavery. He and Anna were reunited, and they moved, as I mentioned, to New Bedford. They were in New York City where they were married, and then they moved to New Bedford. And in New Bedford, he tried to get work, and and it was in New Bedford where he was discovered and asked to speak in Nantucket. Once the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard him, they hired him after that speech in Nantucket in 1841, and he became one of their speakers. So he was paid, he got a salary, and he moved to Lynn. And so and he's living in Lynn, Massachusetts, and that's where he writes his autobiography. But there's one incident, there's several incidents, but one incident that I want to call to your attention. It was Tuesday morning, and Frederick Douglass was on his way to the Lynn Depot to catch a train. Hired only a few weeks earlier as an agent or traveling lecturer by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, he had been on the go almost every day. On this day, September 28, 1841, the 23-year-old runaway slave was headed to a meeting of the Essex County Anti-Slavery Society in Newburyport. He was traveling with James N. Buffin of Lynn, a prominent white abolitionist and builder. So what happens is, he's already becoming established. He's meeting people through the Anti-Slavery Society and furthering their work. He's with a group. They board the Eastern Railroad train together for what should have been an uneventful ride. However, no sooner had Collins and Douglass settled into their seats, they were confronted by the conductor, a small man who appeared to be agitated. He was pale of death, Collins wrote later. His lips quivered. The conductor recognized Douglass from an incident a few weeks earlier. On September 8th, at the station in Newburyport, he had ordered the light-skinned Douglass, whom Collins described as 1 or 2 shades darker than Daniel Webster, to move from a car for white passengers to forward to the Jim Crow car in compliance with a new railroad policy. When Douglass refused, the conductor ordered a handful of railroad workers to drag him into the segregated car. During the fray, Douglass's clothes were torn and Collins was injured. Okay, so this happened 3 weeks before. Okay, 3 weeks later, the scene was much the same. Once again, the conductor ordered Douglass to move, and once again, the fugitive slave politely refused. During the stalemate, Buffin asked if he could accompany Douglass to the Jim Crow car, but that was rejected. I'd soon as haul you out of this car, and I'd haul him from this, the conductor said, according to an account Collins wrote for The Liberator, the anti-slavery newspaper in Boston. There are but a very few in this car. Why, since no objection has been made, do you order me out? Douglass asked, if you will give me any good reason why I should leave this car, I'd willingly go. But without such a reason, I do not feel the liberty to leave. Though you can do with me as you please, I shall not resist. You have asked the question before, said the conductor. I mean to keep you asking over and over again as long as you continue to assault me in this manner, replied Douglass. Pressed for a reason, the conductor mumbled, because you're black. The railroad official then grabbed Douglass by the collar, but had no luck with the younger, stronger men. When the female traveling with the abolitionist refused to get out of his way, the conductor grabbed her by the arm and led her to the back of the car. At this point, the little man yelled for help, and more than a half dozen railroad workers responded. Snake out that D nigger, one of them cried. The company's minions, as the general agent called them, grabbed Douglass and Collins, who were sitting together and holding tight to their seat. Finally, the workers ripped out the seat and carried the two abolitionists, seat and all, down the aisle, dumping them onto the platform. So literally, you have to, this is 1841, you have to think, it's bolted. The seats are bolted. This is a railroad car. They pulled, the workers came, threw them both out. They fell. Mr. Collins was injured. We'll talk about the woman who was accompanying them, Abby Kelly Foster, who was a fantastic abolitionist from Worcester. So this is what one of my students said is like a Rosa Parks, thank you. I started to say Rosetta Parks, I'm thinking, but a Rosa Parks moment because he refused. And you have to remember, just like with Dr. King's initial nonviolence stance, the teachings of Gandhi, passive resistance. So they were, all the Garrisonians, all the anti-slavery workers were taught that. Do not fight, do not say anything. And so there was several damages, several injuries, one of which his hand was injured, which he never recovered from, and of course Mr. Collins actually suffered a greater injury. But I just want to explain that all during these times when he's going on these speaking engagements, he spoke in Weymouth, he spoke in Grafton, Lynn, he was in Abington, he was in North Bridgewater, as I mentioned. All these, sometimes the reception was brutal, not so much by the people who wanted to end slavery, but by others. Okay. I didn't mention this particular slide is what her name was, Ottilia Assing. Ottilie, they called her, and she was a German journalist, and she actually translated the narrative into German. She came to this country, and so his narrative was actually published worldwide, and she was the translator. She became very close to the family. It was rumored that that they had an affair. When his wife died, Ossie was actually, Miss Ossing thought that Frederick would propose to her, and he didn't. And unfortunately, August 21st, 1884, she committed suicide. Now, what happened was Helen Pitts, at this time, Frederick Douglass had moved. From Lynn, he moves to Rochester, New York. He does work. As some of you know, he published the North Star. He's doing a lot of work. Friends of his from England have supported him. His house is burned down in Rochester. They don't know who did it. So he decides to move the family, lock, stock, and barrel. They move to Anacostia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. He works for the federal government. One of the people that he meets there is Helen Pitts. She's several years, I think 20 years, his junior. And they marry. It's a very, very controversial. And so you have a situation where the family is very upset. Rosetta says, if you must marry, Dad, at your age, why not marry one of our women? And his response is, I have to be true to myself, and it is my life, and so it's very controversial. This is Abby Kelly Foster, the abolitionist who was, she was on board in Lynn the time that he was assaulted. Now, most of the students in Mrs. Manchester's class know this lady as well as the audience, Harriet Tubman, who was very, very close friends with Frederick Douglass. And I think one of the things as we talk about women's rights, she's not, she was a station master, great in her own right. Her and Frederick Douglass were very good friends. And one of the things he said to her, and we have this in the writings, that what I do is, you know, I do for our cause to end slavery, but you're constantly on the front lines because, as you know, hundreds of people, she led hundreds of people to freedom. And they had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. One of the things that people don't realize, Frederick Douglass, his wife, Anna Murray Douglass, they were what we call station masters. So there's the Underground Railroad, which many people think was created by the Quakers. The Quakers were actually very instrumental in strengthening the Underground Railroad, but the Underground Railroad was actually created originally by Native Americans. So what happened is African Americans would run away from being enslaved, and they would run to the west, and various Native American tribes, Cherokee, Seminole, would take them in. And so the actual roots of the Underground Railroad are Native American. Later on, it becomes the Quakers in 1688 were the first organized religious group that spoke against slavery, and many of the quilts and other things that we talk about in terms of the Underground Railroad were their contributions. Sojourner Truth, another great woman. These are just pictures now. This is William Lloyd Garrison, president of the Anti-Slavery Society. Wendell Phillips, whose father was mayor of Boston, ardent champion of the anti-slavery cause. And does anybody know who this person is? Susan B. Anthony, very good. Susan B., a leading feminist. One of the things that Frederick Douglass did, he was the first and only male that was invited and attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. But he was one of those few males that always spoke for suffrage. And there was a time when there was a split because some of them felt that female suffrage should be attached to male suffrage for the slave. And he said, no, not at this time. But they were able to put that, aside, and later on he regrouped with the feminists. Anyone else? Lucretia Mott, very good. Lucretia Mott, Quaker abolitionist. And what happened is he again, 1848 in Seneca Falls, 1851, they had a women's convention in Worcester, and Frederick Douglass was amongst the few males in attendance. This woman, most people don't know who she is. Does anybody? William Lloyd Garrison is the face of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. This is Maria Weston Chapman. She was a secretary of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and she actually, most historians believe, she's the one that really ran the show. When Frederick needed money when he was in Europe, he would write to her. She actually was the power behind even though William Lloyd Garrison was the face, she was the power behind the movement here in Massachusetts. This is his residence in Anacostia, which is part of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. Beautiful if you ever have a chance to, if you're in D.C. to visit. And this is actually his study. The desk and the volumes are there. In 1895, he died. There's a wonderful full-page obituary that the New York Times ran at the time, which is just outstanding, talking about his accomplishments and so forth. And he had, earlier that day, he had spoken at a convention for women's rights, came back, he was planning on going out, and he suffered a massive heart attack. And at first, Helen thought he was joking, and because he used to do pranks like that. And then they called for a doctor, and he expired. Now,
Okay, how did his first wife die, and what happened to the woman that he supposedly had an affair with?
Okay, well, his first wife died. Anna was very sick, and she did work for she was a seamstress. I mentioned earlier she was a free woman of color living in Baltimore. And so she was a seamstress, and she would, for various anti-slavery rallies, she would make quilts and that kind of thing. Well, she became sickly, so it was natural causes. The woman, Ottilie Assing, Ottilia was her real name, but they called her Ottilie. She, the journalist from Germany, she was from a wealthy family in Germany. And after Anna's death, she went back to Europe, and she was distraught. And she always thought that once Anna passed, that Frederick would marry her. And so, and some historians feel that's why she took her own life.
We have a second question from here.
Okay, well. Okay, yes.
My mind has been blown by the statement about pranks. I've always thought that Frederick Douglass was one of the most serious guys in history, so I want to hear more about that.
All right, well, I was going to say you can see where the humor, the jokes right over here, this lady, yeah. He in some of his books where he would play pranks, he would jokes. I'm trying to think of a few of them. Actually, as I'm reading, I'm trying to think a couple. Some are subtle and some are not subtle. And one of the things, somebody asked me, why don't we have, when he was in North Bridgewater, why don't we have a record of that? The forerunner to the Brockton Enterprise, which was established in 1881, was the North Bridgewater Gazette. And a lot of the original Gazette papers were destroyed. So one would have to go to the Mass Historical Society or someplace else to try to find. But they did mention when he came to North Bridgewater. But he does have there's a sense of humor, and I did some of the old gazettes that we have. I read a couple, and you can see the humor. You can really see it, but I can't speak roughly to what it was. But he did have a sense of humor.
Just a bit of trivia. I read a book on first woman that ever ran for president of the United States. Her name was Victoria Woodhull in 1872, and Frederick Douglass ran as her vice president. He was a big suffragette, as you said.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. That's correct. That was a party. It was because it wasn't recognized, but they and some of the people that just for them to have that meeting, several people were arrested. That is true. Yeah.
I wanted to know the relationship he might have had with John Brown. Did they have any kind of discussion? Or I know he made a comment on John Brown's strategy, but I don't remember it. I would like you to clarify that.
All right. John Brown, Frederick Douglass and John Brown were friends. As you know, John Brown lived in Springfield, Massachusetts before the whole Bleeding Kansas incident. And John Brown was a radical. He was a radical abolitionist, and near the end, he resorted to violence, as we know. Now, what happened was Frederick Douglass tried to persuade him not to do the attack on Harper's Ferry, and unfortunately, John Brown came to him, and there were witnesses, and Frederick Douglass tried to dissuade him. And after the attack, people wanted to get Frederick Douglass, so that's the first time that he left. He left and went to Europe because there was they wanted to prove, the government wanted to prove that he actually was a co-conspirator. So he had to. That's why he left. That's why the first time he went to Boston and went to Europe, to England aboard the Cambria. That's when he did his speaking tour in Ireland and Scotland and other places. Good question. See, this is why I like to say the.
Well,
yeah.
I was going to point out, Willie, that when you had the talk back in November, you had these huge cutouts of some of the suffragettes and Frederick Douglass, and I wanted you to speak a little bit on his stature, because he was not a person that could sneak into a room. There was no way that was going to happen, because I think he was a fairly tall person. Is that right? So I just wanted, when you had those, you could actually just see that he was an impressive figure.
Right.
So were there any comments in his writings or things that people made that, when he walked into a room, people immediately took notice or anything like that?
This is the thing that upsets so many people. After he goes to England, he leaves after John Brown, the attack on Harper's Ferry, and he escapes. He goes to England, and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society is paying for the trip, and he meets abolitionists there, and in England and Ireland, it's the first time he feels really free, and so one of the things about that freedom, people aren't interested in his skin color or what have you, and it's just Frederick Douglass, the person. And so he goes to these rallies. He has high tea with some of the nobility, and the person that he really, Daniel O'Connor, who was a famous revolutionary in his own right, was one of Frederick Douglass's heroes. And he, as some of you probably know, he fought for Catholic emancipation. And so he goes. He's in Ireland. And Daniel O'Connor is speaking. I think there were 4,000 people in the auditorium at the time. And one of Daniel's sons says, Frederick Douglass is here. And he actually goes to, Daniel O'Connor stops his speech and says, come up here. And so they had a very close relationship. Now, Daniel O'Connor was an abolitionist himself. So he would be known if he was in England or Scotland and there was an American and they shook hands or they were meeting and he would say, do you own slaves? And if the person said yes, then he wouldn't shake his hand. He said, I can't have anything to do with you. That's the kind of person he was. So Frederick was struck. He loved that feeling of being independent and free. So he would walk down the street with a Scottish woman or English person, or female or male. And so one of the things that really bothered the African American community at that time was, you're not, when he came back, he had that same feeling. He said, you're not in Scotland or England. You could get lynched. You shouldn't do that. And he never, and especially once he married Helen, who was of Quaker background from, some of her ancestors were from Massachusetts. It really created a lot of consternation amongst various people in both families. Yes.
We have a question, student question.
Oh.
Actually, we welcome questions from the students, so we have our first student question.
Okay. Well, I think it's the second student question. There was one over there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, hi. I just want to say thank you for coming out and talking to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
How did the use of the Underground Railroad change, like before, during, and after slavery?
What a good question. How did the use of the Underground Railroad change, particularly during and after slavery? That's a good question. First of all, you have to look at I told you earlier that there were radical abolitionists and abolitionists. So even though we have Underground Railroads stations and stops in North Bridgewater, Abington, New Bedford, some of the people that supported the Underground Railroad were just abolitionists. The station masters, the people who, like Anna Murray, who kept people, remember, these were slaves running away. They had no money. You had to feed them. You had to clothe them. You had to spend your own money to get them transportation to the next stop. So it became a network for all the different stops became networks for those people who didn't want to go further all the way to Canada, mainly on Ontario. They over time, as slavery was eradicated, when we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those stations became like societies where they would help people, former slaves, get jobs, get training. So it was still a network, but it wasn't the end. After slavery, it wasn't so much freedom. It was to help better yourself skills so you could be a working part of the community. Some people who were in Canada did come back. A lot stayed in Canada. So the ones that did return, they returned to the Detroit area, Saginaw, those portions of Michigan near the Canadian border. Good question.
Any more questions? Let me go with the lady first.
Can you address the relationship he had with President Lincoln?
Okay. The question was, could I address the relationship he had with President Lincoln? Initially, it was very strained. And so Frederick, right from the beginning, wanted President Lincoln to actually to come out forcefully and say, we want to free the slaves. We want African American men to participate in the Civil War. And Lincoln was reticent to do that. So initially it became strained. As the relationship went on, President Lincoln began to respect him more and more, and they became friends. So, in fact, there was one incident where he was at the White House, and the president was getting ready to give a speech, and Frederick Douglass was outside, and he just looked in. He didn't even want to approach the president, and the president happened to notice, and a security guard, a police officer, said, "No, you can't go." And President Lincoln said, "Oh, that's my friend Frederick Douglass. Mr. Douglass, come here." And they became close friends. As you know, President Lincoln he just wanted to keep the Union together. So if slavery, if we could have slavery and keep the Union together, he was for it. But as time went on, he realized that was not the case. And so the Emancipation Proclamation initially just freed those slaves in slave states. Most people, it didn't free all the slaves. So it was a tactical strategy, a maneuver that Frederick Douglass realized was necessary, and so they became friends. The more they agreed, the more they met. Frederick Douglass was on point, one of the recruiters for African Americans. As you know, here in Massachusetts, we had the 54th and the 55th. We were the first state to have colored troops. Those were mustered out of Camp Meade. Governor Andrew was a governor. He was an abolitionist governor, and he was right up front. When President Lincoln was assassinated, his wife insisted that Frederick Douglass have the president's walking stick, which still remains with the family today. So there was a close relationship. She even realized in her bouts of depression and so forth that they had a wonderful relationship. Good question. See, this is what I mean. You have to have the questions.
Yes, Mr. Wilson. So you're saying those ugly incidents that happened on the railroads with Frederick Douglass, a lot of them happened up north?
Oh, yes. So what happens is we have, in fact, if you, here in New England, if you notice a lot of the stone walls, there was slavery here. So slavery did exist in the North, but it was different from slavery in the South because the slaves lived here in the homes, in the salt boxes, in the colonials with the family. So it wasn't as brutal, but slavery did exist here. And there was what people don't realize, Frederick Douglass just didn't speak out against slavery. He spoke out against race prejudice. And he would say, just like Dr. King later on, 100 years later, that, just because you're in the North, you're just as prejudiced as the person in Birmingham, Alabama, even though you might be in Boston. So he was asking about addressing equal rights all the time. Yes.
Mr. Wilson, kind of piggybacking off of that, with the passage of, with the Fugitive Slave Act, we had some really very bad incidents here in this area.
Right.
Was he still here or was he in New York? And if he was in this area, was he involved in activities at that time?
Right. Now, here's the thing. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. So we actually have a house, what's the name of it? It's right in Bridgewater Center. The Better Bean is right. The Tory House. So the Tory House was built in the 1600s. That was one of the abolitionists. That was one of the station stops for the Underground Railroad. So even though what the fugitive slave law said is if you helped a runaway slave, the government could fine you, jail you, confiscate your property. So it really created a lot of tension. And people don't realize Brockton, North Bridgewater, was a shoe capital of the world. So was Lynn. So a lot of those shoes were manufactured for the slave plantations. They called them clabbers. So the shoes were made in such a way that it didn't matter if it was a right foot or a left foot, it would fit. It was a general shoe, and a lot of the shoe industry, the industrialists, didn't want to upset their southern market. So you had a lot of tension, and it's more complicated than what people realize. And the fact that some people were jailed or could have their property confiscated. So the law. And the other thing is, my students used to say, well, why did they do the law? Don't forget, that law brought in, your students should realize that law brought in California as a free state. So they were all up to slavery, there were compromises made. And that fugitive slave law was detrimental to African Americans particularly, but in general, don't forget we got some free states added. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is, after Frederick Douglass ran away and he was free, he was in New York City, and he's on his way to New Bedford. He bumps into a friend of his, and he says, you've got to be very careful because they had the white Southern plantation owners hired African Americans to help track down runaway slaves. And he was so frightened and depressed. And he was just newly married. He said, we got to get out of here. His name at the time was Frederick Johnson. When he got to New Bedford, another African American abolitionist said, you can't have Johnson. There are 100 Johnsons here. You know, so that's when he switched his name to Douglas, and it was out of a book from by Sir Walter Scott that his African American friend was reading. He said, "Why not Douglas?" And that's how the name changed. So he's always suspicious, and now he's newly free, but he's very nervous. So that's why he felt that you really had to fight for freedom, not just slavery, but rights. Right here. Yes.
Yes, thank you. You have referred a couple of times to Frederick Douglass's Descendants, the fact that they still have Lincoln's walking stick, for example. And I apologize if you already addressed this, but do you happen to know if any of them are more or less public figures today? Do any of them do similar to what you're doing tonight? Do any of them speak, or any of them socially active?
The only one that I know of is Frederick Douglass IV, who we had. And I don't know of any other. I don't know of it, but he and his wife, her nickname is BJ. I don't know what their children are doing, but he's the only one that he does reenactments. He visits to try to keep the family history alive. Yes.
Two pieces of information that your audience might enjoy is in Cincinnati. They built this enormous, and I mean enormous, museum dedicated to the Underground Railroad. And people are sitting here going, why Cincinnati? Well, Cincinnati is right on the Ohio River, which is across from Kentucky. And a lot of the people who were running away as slaves would cross from Kentucky across the Ohio River into Cincinnati, and that's why they built the museum there. And for people here who would like to learn about the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts, if they go to Beacon Hill, there's an African American museum right on Beacon Hill, which runs a walking tour of Beacon Hill, where they talk a lot about the African American experience on Beacon Hill, as well as the Underground Railroad. And one of the stories that I found very interesting was there was a family who was very involved in the Underground Railroad on Beacon Hill. And the owner, and this gentleman lived in the house on Beacon Hill, and he had a keg of gunpowder.
Right, that's Mr. Hayden.
In his door.
Yeah.
And when people looking for runaway slaves would come to his door, he'd greet them at the door with a rifle pointed down at the gunpowder.
Right.
In other words, they tried to break into the house.
Yeah, he would threaten to blow it up. Now that exhibit, I'm glad you mentioned that exhibit that's on Frederick Douglass is there, and you speak to another issue. When Africans first came to Boston, they landed in what is now the North End. So the first black community in New England was in the North End. It was called Guinea. Then they moved up to the southern slope of Beacon Hill. Then the third migration was to the South End, and then to Roxbury and Dorchester. So you're absolutely right. Now, the church, the Museum of African American History, was built in 1805, and it's the oldest extant building. And the museum, I'm telling you, and the current exhibit, it was only supposed to be in Boston for 1 year. This is the third year, and it's on Frederick Douglass. And it really is worth the trip. I mean, it's outstanding. And you're absolutely right. There's a tour that talks about all of those buildings, because that's where the black community lived, on the southern slope. And it's very, very fascinating. Thank you for that. Yes.
Hi.
Stand up so people can see you.
Hi. Was Frederick Douglass okay with the fact, not the fact, but the strategy that Abraham Lincoln had of only freeing slaves in slave states? Did he have a problem with them not freeing the slaves in like Missouri or Kentucky or Delaware, for example?
Right. Very good question. Frederick, that's where their tension was. But one of the things Frederick Douglass didn't realize is Lincoln was a politician, and even though Frederick Douglass was one of the factors that persuaded him that slavery had to go, now they were arguing about what speed, what rate. So that's why you have the 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And many people believe had Lincoln not been assassinated, we would have had a more seamless introduction to those amendments. And during Reconstruction, you have to remember, during Reconstruction, we had an opportunity to end a lot of things, but the federal government pulled out. So we had to wait 100 years to the Civil Rights Movement, But we had an opportunity in the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period is an excellent historical period. It was an opportunity, but the federal government didn't have the courage. The radical abolitionists were removed, and so you had a situation. We have the institution of Jim Crow. But you're right, that was a tension with their relationship, but they still were friends. Because I think from the readings I have, Frederick Douglass realized that Abraham Lincoln was the president, and Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. And the politics that Lincoln dealt with, I think Douglass got to respect over time. So they were still friends, and that's evidence when Miss Mary Todd Lincoln gave Frederick the walking stick.
Any other questions?
One of the abolition societies officially buy Douglass's freedom when he was in England?
Okay. The question was, didn't one of the abolitionist societies buy Douglass's freedom? What happened was a family in England did buy his freedom. And that's where he had a major rift with William Lloyd Garrison. Because Garrisonians believed by Frederick Douglass allowing somebody to buy his freedom, you're part of the system. And they're saying, don't be a part of the system. And that's when he had a major break. It was a family, in fact, 2 sisters, and they actually supported the North Star. So they found out what the amount was. They contacted their lawyer in London. The lawyer in London contacted Mr. Auld in Maryland, and they actually paid I can't remember the amount, but they purchased his freedom, which upset William Lloyd Garrison a lot, and that's when they began to, there was a rift, because Frederick Douglass worked for them. So they would tell the shots, you go here, you go to Indiana, you go here, don't say this, do say that. And so then he felt like after the European experience, he felt that he didn't need them. He could be a speaker of his own. So he didn't need the Anti-Slavery Society. He wanted to do it on his own. And there were other African-American abolitionists who they weren't as effective because they didn't have the money that the Anti-Slavery Society had. And so when Douglass went on his own, he inspired them to also be individualists and stand up for their own views. Good questions. Yes.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Well, we were going to talk about women's suffrage, and I wanted to know if his support for women's suffrage, did it get to also be support for his daughters being raised differently, being as well educated as his sons, for example? Or how deep was that support?
Okay, it's very deep. Rosetta, she lived in Lynn, but because Lynn had segregated schools, they had a tutor for her, and I actually had a couple of things on that. So he experienced that, and so his whole feeling was that education should be broadened. It should be universal, and he actually he spoke about that. That was one of the reasons why he was so supportive to for women's rights. on July 5th, 1852, Douglas delivered an address to the ladies of the Rochester Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. The speech eventually became known as What to the Slave is the July 4th, and some consider it his greatest anti-slavery oration ever given. He used every opportunity, and particularly because some of the men did not want to talk about these issues. And the female societies always talked about slavery, freedom, and they were always concerned. Temperance. He was a teetotaler. He didn't drink at all. Very well respected in England. He was, so that the women's societies always had a lot of the issues that Frederick wanted to talk about. And so that's why whenever they invited him, he went. But he felt education was very important, and he experienced firsthand the discrimination that his daughter experienced because she couldn't go to certain schools. So they had to get tutors. They sent her to, at one point in time, she went to Philadelphia. She got Rosetta. She later married a gentleman called Sprague, Mr. Sprague. So she got a real good education, but he always had to fight, because there's a double standard. Everybody knows this. During this 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the men would be educated, but the women were relegated to the home. So Frederick Douglass was one of the first people that said, no, you educate both. Because an educated woman can have a greater impact on the family because she's with the children for a longer period of time. So he's one of the first males to recognize that and to articulate it. Yep.
With that said, why didn't he educate his wife that didn't know how to read?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. That's one of the questions historians have. First of all, she was a great woman. She was, station master. She fed and clothed, but he hired tutors, and she just didn't want to. I don't know. She put a wall up, and she didn't want to be in the limelight. Some speaking engagements she would go, but most of the time she wanted to be in the background, and it's one of the questions that still comes up after she died. Rosetta, who was really the spokesperson for the family, said my mother was a great woman, and but she just refused, and she was free. That's the thing that always struck me. So she had an opportunity because she wasn't a slave, and she was free by birthright, So that meant that somebody was free in her family, and she had skills, but she just never wanted to be literate. She never learned. They hired tutors. She had relatives that stayed with the family, but she never. She just didn't do it. We don't know all the. I'm just telling you what I've read.
So, what was his interaction with her in public? Did he acknowledge her, and was she have any type of speaking role, period?
No, that's the thing. He would always acknowledge her, but the marriage was strained because you can imagine he's in first of all, he's away a lot, so he's on the anti-slavery circuit. So she's home raising the children, and so we have documents that say send money to the family and so forth, which the society did. And then you're in England, you're in Scotland, and you're walking down the main promenade with a white woman on your shoulder, and and then he does that here, and so it's like it's a strained relationship, but they loved each other, and but we don't know why she never broke that. They had tutors for her. She just never. She just didn't. She remained illiterate.
What was the relationship with the children, as far as how they interact with the mother, knowing that she was the less educated, yet and still, you're stating that she ran the household. How can she be limited to extend, greater?
Yeah. Well, this is we have one article that Rosetta wrote concerning that, because she was, after her mother died, she became the spokesman. When the family lived in Anacostia, when he remarried Helen Pitts, so his sons and everybody lived at the Anacostia home. And it is, like I said, it's still one of those questions that, that's why I always say, I mentioned her. She was a great woman, but she was never illiterate. And I think it does speak to the relationship with the family. I mean, Rosetta writes about it and puts her mother forward as being a positive, but none of the boys do. I take that back. I haven't seen anything. So the other thing is things are always released, but that's a very good question. Yeah, very good question.
Any more questions? I just wanted to say a few things. I think you're an amazing speaker.
Oh, thank you.
And we have two pieces. I'm a scientist, so we have two pieces of evidence here. First, look at the size of this crowd. At one point, I counted 150 people. That's an amazing size for our town, Stoughton. The second, I look at the engagement. I give lectures. I never get that many questions. So you're so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I have one announcement, actually a couple of announcements. The video we are taking, I thank Stoughton Media Access Corporation, which is our local access cable channel. They'll process the video and run it. It'll probably take them a week. They will be running it on the TV channel. I'll also ask them to put it on as a video on YouTube. So if anybody wants to, we hope that you will share that because it's so much information. So let us know. We'll give you the link. We have a sign-up sheet if you're interested in we have a great committee on diversity. We have a lot of fun. We just did a dance. We got like 40 people. We learned how to dance. But these were dances, international dances from different countries. So anybody interested, we'd love to have you on our committee. Here's the sign-up sheet.
Thank you for having me.
One more announcement. This event was co-sponsored by Stoughton Public Library. And we had Pat Basler in the back. So she's been slaving in the kitchen preparing you all the goodies. Thank you, Pat.